Okay, I would like to thank everyone for coming today. We have a treat today. We have Dr. Jackson and Miss Stacy. Um, may begin, Miss Stacy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this very special day. I am Stacy LaDonna, the founder and executive director of Black Children's Books and Authors. I will give you a brief description of today's topic, and then I will introduce Dr. Carleen Payne Jackson. Black history is American history, but many times Black voices and stories get left out of American history. Today, August 26th, is Women's Equality Day. The year 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. However, the role of Black women and other women of color played in the suffrage movement is often minimized. Ida B. Wells once said, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." So today, on this day, Women's Equality Day, Dr. Jackson is going to turn the light of truth on the role that Black women played in the early suffrage movement and our present day role as a powerful voting bloc. Dr. Carleen Jackson, Dr. Carleen Payne Jackson was born in St. Kitts in the Caribbean. She holds dual BA degrees in English and sociology from Stillman College, an MA in Latin American and Caribbean Studies from New York University, and a PhD in history from University of West Indies in Jamaica. Since 2008, she has served at Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee in various positions, including as an assistant professor of history, history department chair, chair of the Division of Business, Social and Behavioral Sciences, and most recently, director of Lane Institute, a student success center. Her teaching and scholarship are focused on African diaspora, which includes African Americans, African Caribbeans, and Afro Latinos, and women's studies. Her course offerings include African history, Black history, history of the African diaspora, history of Latin America and the Caribbean, and the history of women. In 2015, she collaborated with Charles Johnson in the publication of the textbook Topics in African Diaspora History, published by Kendall Hunt in 2016. She is a fierce advocate of gender equality and has presented extensively on Black women. We want to welcome Dr. Jackson with us today, and I would caution everyone to please save all your questions until Dr. Jackson completes her presentation. You can put them in the text box. Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. You may proceed.
Thank you, all of you, for being here today and for giving me this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite, absolute favorite topics, Black history. Not necessarily women's history, but Black history, because women's history has a certain position in Black history that is challenging. So I am going to try today to tell you where we are and where we're going with this thing called history. A lot of people view history as something that happened in the past and there's no need to revisit. What's done is done and we can let it go. Sometimes people say, why don't you just get over it? History is not past. History is very much part of our present. As a matter of fact, history shaped our present. And so there's no way we can ignore it. It will really be valuable if we can understand it because it reveals just why things are the way we are. And since this is Women's Equality Day, I think it's a good time for us to reflect as well as commemorate. Commemorate suggests that we're clapping hands and we're fine with it, but reflection might say, okay, we did get some doors opened, but we still have a long way to go. So I thought I'd start with why do this in the first place. A lot of people, they are not necessarily concerned about history when they want to be entertained. So I am not trying to entertain you. I'm trying to share with you where we are and why we are where we are. Another thing I think is important to say, this is about diversity as well. Diversity and inclusion. And a lot of times American history whitewashes its way to a history of accomplishment and achievement and greatness. And sometimes the people, all of the people who contributed to that history are not included. And so this is a way to include Black women's history in Americans' history. So that's the why it's important to do this, because we're in a period where we need to acknowledge all of the people who contributed to where we are today. So you now have my cover point, the cover page of my PowerPoint on screen, and I'll go ahead if you are ready. Are you ready? Are you all ready?
We are.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so Women's Equality Day. I like the sound of that. Of course, all women are equal. We don't often get the same treatment as others, but a special occasion means that we are committed to making that happen. And not only is it Women's Equality Day, it's the centennial of the women's vote, for God's sake. So this is a very special day. And as Stacey LaDonna said earlier, we are commemorating the adoption of the 19th Amendment, which prohibits denial of the right to vote on the basis of sex or gender. So why am I complaining? When I study the history of the suffrage movement in the United States, I run into some problems as a scholar, and I call them historiographical challenges. Historiography has to do with the way in which history is taught, not the way in which it happened. How it happened, we can't really change that. But the way in which we teach others about it, that's critical. And there are about 3 or 4 challenges I run into every time I try to share this with my students and my scholars at Lane College. And part of that is there's a history of women's suffrage with Black women barely there. They are at the margins in the history book. They are what we call submerged. And you say, well, what do you mean submerged? I look at the pictures online and I see lots of Black women, I see lots of white women. But when you read the textbooks, the historians focus largely on the leadership of white women. It's the great school approach to history, where they pick out 1 or 2 persons and that tells the story of the whole. So the story is told about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and what happened to the National Women's Suffrage movement after its splinters. The date 1848 is important because that's when the Seneca Fall Convention happened and women had, they got a voice, they got a stage for the movement. But it is important to note that no Black woman attended the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. So Black women were absent intentionally. They were not invited. It's not that they didn't want to be there. They were not invited. And it's not that they were invisible and nobody knew who they were, because the first advocates for women's rights, they hooked their movement to the abolitionist crusade that was taking place. And the abolitionist crusade was about getting rid of slavery. So Black women were already activists. And so, they could have just joined the movement and recognized what had been accomplished so far. Instead, they used it to gain attention, but they excluded Black women from the start. When I say that, I'm talking about those early pioneers of women's suffrage. Another challenge: when the 15th Amendment was passed after the Civil War, there was a big dust-up, a lot of contention about why is it that the Black male is getting the vote before white women had the vote. As a matter of fact, they just kind of went off the rails on that, and that's the only aspect of the race issue that white women were willing to contend with. So it was a rather skewed focus on the implication of the Black male vote, when one considers that during the Reconstruction era, it was more on paper than anything else. Black women couldn't really vote, Black men couldn't really vote. So why Black women were so concerned with the 15th Amendment and felt insulted by it is sometimes hard to understand. So that sometimes takes up pages in a textbook, and the broader race issues are not discussed. So what do I mean by the broader race issues? Black women were dealing with an issue that sociologists call intersectionality. And that's the fact that Black women are encountering a dual challenge or a double jeopardy. They are being discriminated on the basis of their gender as well as their race, which meant that the issue was more challenging by far for Black women than for white women. White women were prepared to deal with the sexism issue, but they were not comfortable dealing with the issue of race. And so 1920 is a crescendo for white history. For Black women, it's just a pause, and the crusade continues. Long after 1920, Black women and men were still struggling to exercise their right to vote. So there was an incomplete revolution, and a lot of textbooks just don't even acknowledge that. They just act as everything was fine after 1920. The history is done, the revolution is done, and that's that. And so the history of what comes after, that gets lost in the weeds. For Black people, they never had the luxury of just focusing on votes. And because there is not this crusade with placards all about votes all over the place, and we look at Black history, a lot of people even just come to the conclusion that voting was not a major issue for them. But since power is encapsulated in the voting process and the political process, I just want to remind you, for Black people, that was at the heart of what they needed. There was a need for political power. There was a need for them to bring their concerns to the table and to get a response from the people who had opportunities and the resources to answer their concerns. So what we're talking about, the need for political power, there was this political disfranchisement that was happening, which meant Black concerns didn't even get to the table. There were all kind of, despite the 15th Amendment, there were poll taxes, voter intimidation, grandfather clauses, all kind of ways in which Blacks could not access voting. Civil rights acts have been passed over and over again, but there was no teeth in them. There was no way to make sure that they happened. And don't even mention the Reconstruction Amendments. Blacks were supposed to be citizens of voting rights, and when Reconstruction was canceled in 1877, when the federal troops were taken out of the South, it was tantamount to conceding failure and leaving Blacks to their own devices. And the ultimate slap in the face, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, where Blacks were treated like second or third class citizens. They lived in a segregated South, a segregated country, and so just all of these different roadblocks were placed in the way by people with political power, and they knew that they needed that kind of access in order to change their circumstances. And by the way, I know this is a tough picture to look at, but a lot of people, when they think of lynching, they think of Black men being lynched. And I just want to remind you that Black women were also targeted. So the scope of the challenges faced here, the vote can hardly answer all of it, but that was a very critical aspect of it. Now, why do I want to focus on the Black political woman? Because for Black women, and I am absolutely sure of this, you don't have to be, but I believe activism is part and parcel of their everyday life. When you're people who are historically and contemporarily oppressed, rebellion becomes part of what you do. And, I used to have to convince people it's not a bad thing to be an activist. And then I found this wonderful quote by Phyllis Wheatley, a first published African American. She says, "In every human breast, God has implanted a love of freedom, and it is impatient, and it pants for deliverance." So part and part of women's history in this particular era, it's a continuation of that tendency to rebel against oppression. And I think that kind of history needs to be shared. So who are some of these women who are part of that crusade? Do you know their names? If you know their names, place one of those names in the chat. I want to see if you know them. This is the thing about most people's history. They know who their heroes are. Do you know who your heroes are? Now, what am I looking at particularly today? how African American women shaped and fueled the political evolution. Who ignited the fight? Who laid the groundwork for Black access to the ballot? Who brought us from the margin to the center? And you're saying, why so much focus on who? Because I want you to know those names. I want you to know those heroines. Now, in the broadest possible way, you have to understand that any disenfranchised group has to find ways to get their concerns on the political agenda. And Black women have been very much a part of that. Black women, Black men, white women, white men, everybody does it. That's what disenfranchised groups do. They try to change. So this is not a new thing. This is just that we are often not acknowledged in terms of the role that we play. So there are three different things I'm going to look at here. Those pioneers, they did not have a formal political agenda, and a lot of times they're left out. But without these pioneers, whose shoulders are we really standing on? So we look at Black women in the suffrage movement and Black women coming into their own in the modern political arena. So, pioneers. I like pictures, I like images, I like sketches because they tell you that they were real people just like you and I. And some of them, you can revere them because they were living in such extreme times. So, when did Black women begin agitating political rights? I think probably when they got off the slave ships. But when they organized formally, you begin to see this in the anti-slavery societies that were created up and down the United States. And the interesting thing about the anti-slavery movement, it was interracial. And as I told you earlier, white women found that it was a way to get their concerns on stage. So anti-slavery activism was ultimately linked to the suffrage movement. Who were some of those women who dared, even before slavery was abolished, even before freedom? 1865 is the official date. Who were these women and what kind of impact did they have? Since we're telling you there was not a formal suffrage movement, they're really working on two fronts. They're dealing with anti-slavery issues, they're dealing with civil rights issues like voting. These are some of the women, and most of the time they're speaking, they're writing, they're agitating. One of the earliest writers and political presenters was a woman by the name of Maria Stewart, and I am amazed at how many people don't even know her. She published political pamphlets and she delivered lectures, which meant that after she left the stage after barely 3 years, her material still was available. She was the first woman who spoke before a male audience, an entire male audience. And she said, what if I'm a woman? I still have something to say. I have a cause and I will not be silenced. So Maria Stewart, I think, deserves to be placed in a pantheon of Black women pioneers. Of course, most of you know about Sojourner Truth. If you do not, here's your opportunity. She is usually associated with this anti-slavery crusade, but she kept going after 1865, as you can see. So when that debate was going on about the 15th Amendment and Black women getting the right to vote, she was like, I really don't care whether or not they get the right to vote. I just want to make sure that we get our rights as well. That we women, we colored women, get our rights. And I don't hear anybody talking about it. I don't hear anybody advocating for us. And I want to make sure that we're keeping this thing going while things are stirring. So as far as she was concerned, it was okay to talk about it, but just don't leave us women out of it. Sojourner Truth. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is one of the earliest women who actually articulates the suffrage agenda. She is not just focused on suffrage, and you will find that most Black women didn't just focus on suffrage because it was a luxury to just focus on suffrage. They're concerned about everything because Blacks need everything. They need education, they need economics, they need provision. So you're going to find that most Black women suffragettes or suffragists, they were focused on lots of other things. So, but she particularly mentioned her affinity for suffrage issues. So that leads us into the Black suffrage movement. And here are some of the recognizable faces. By the way, I don't know how many of you know about Miss Booker T. Washington. That's Margaret Washington. And she was one of our earliest suffragists. And she just is in the shadow of her husband, so she does not get as much attention. Okay, so what did these early organizers do? They're dealing with the overt racism expressed by many of those white suffragists. And so they're trying to figure out how to keep their concerns on the political agenda. And one of their responses was by becoming more self-sufficient, not relying entirely on their white female counterparts, but to create their own institutions, their own organizations, while they kept their concerns out there. So what we see them having is individual initiatives, local initiatives, organized efforts. And one of the things that we have to do, I think, as a tribute to them, is find out the extent of their impact. And it's, I believe, much more dominant than we expect. Here is a woman before her time. Her name is Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, and she is a media giant. She's publishing a woman's era newspaper, a paper just for African American women. And I believe this was a labor of love. I mean, who can afford this? But what she did is she created a platform for women to put their concerns out there, to give voice to their concerns. She is also one of the pioneering figures in the formation or the emergence of the American Women's Suffrage Association. That's the part when the women suffrage crusade splintered. This is the half that did continue to support Black and women's suffrage. So when she saw value in what was available in terms of Black crusade, she was part of it. So she is one of the pioneering suffragists as well. Now, a lot of people do not understand where the suffrage movement or the energy for the suffrage movement in the Black community led to after the white women jumped ship on that. It was embedded in the Black Women's Club movement. As a matter of fact, a lot of those suffrage organizations are not recognized as such because they're called clubs. A lot of people don't get the club. So the idea is to handle or to address different aspects of Black social welfare. And there were quite a few of those. And if you look closely at the agenda, women's suffrage is always part of it. So it's not, again, just one focus on vote, one focus on suffrage. It's part and parcel of a broader agenda. So if you want to know to what extent were they committed to suffrage, just read their stated objectives. For example, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, one of their stated objectives said they wanted to enforce civil and political rights for African Americans. And a lot of mobilization did occur around that, and not just locally, but also nationally. And in every instance, as I have seen in my research, suffrage was an important part of their agenda. And they did have a political impact at intervals. For example, in 1916, this institution passed a resolution in support of the women's suffrage amendment. And I do like their slogan, lifting as we climb. They understood it was something you pass a law overnight and everything is fine. They knew that it was a long struggle. Okay, here is your first president of the National Association of Colored Women, and she is another suffragist that a lot of people do not know about. Mary Church Terrell was actually quite smart. She stayed with the big white women's movement, the American Women's Suffrage Association. She did not jump ship on it. She did both. She straddled. So she became part of the Black Women Initiative, the National Association of Colored Women, and she stayed. So she was able to operate on both fronts. Some other Black women, they simply founded their own separate suffrage associations. And again, a lot of those are hidden because they are called clubs. Now, perhaps the most famous or the most substantial of Black women's suffrage associations was the Alpha Suffrage Club that was established on Ida B. Wells' initiative. A lot of people do not understand that Ida B. Wells had a hand in everything. She's a political reformer. She addressed everything that was of concern to her in her day. And so she wasn't just the lynching crusader, as people have really just kind of shrunk her down to. She is a suffragist and a political reformer in her own right. And she knew how to use the pen, how to use the newspaper, how to get people's opinions voiced. So the Alpha Suffrage Club and the work of Ida B. Wells deserves, I think, more attention. I have read her Crusade for Justice, her red letter, I've read her little pamphlets, and what she is doing, a lot of people do not realize that there's a sustained criticism of the American political system. She's not just talking about, lynching, she's talking about the power that people have to lynch. Now, the Black women's role in the modern political arena is deliberately tied to the work of those pioneering figures that I talked about. And I just want you to know about some exemplary individuals who helped to make this possible. Now, how did they become exemplary? Because they went above and beyond what was expected in the time based on the barriers that were still erected against women. You can see here that there's a shift occurring from about the 1930s from the margin to the center. So women are not on the margins anymore trying to get attention to their concerns. Women are centering themselves and they're becoming huge voices for their concerns. Here's one of those women, Mary McCleod Bethune. She is Black woman in the White House, you might look at it that way. In the 1930s and early 40s, she's invited to be part of Franklin Roosevelt's Black cabinet, and she advises him on race matters, and she's working closely with Eleanor Roosevelt. In that same period, she's director of Negro Affairs in Roosevelt's National Youth. So here you have some diversity initiatives in the 1930s. And what she's doing while she's representing a president is securing positions and advocacy for African Americans. So she's an extraordinary woman, and a lot of people wondered how she was able to command such input and impact during that time. Now, the thing I find most interesting about Bethune is not that she's working in the White House, but she had a vision beyond the White House. So Bethune, even after she's no longer part of Roosevelt's cabinet, she builds on that clout, that power that she had. She founded the National Council of Negro Women, and they continue to articulate African American concerns. She's a club woman, and she prioritizes education because she sees it as an avenue to empowerment for African Americans. And that Bethune-Cookman Institute that she co-founded has become, a college. Now, this is where Black women really truly begin to come into their own during the Civil Rights Movement. You might recall that the Voting Rights Act emerged out of that Civil Rights Movement. So you know it was part and parcel of that whole creative crusade that African Americans engaged in, where they walked up and down this country and with placards in their hands. And the picture says it all. I don't have to write anything. Just look at how energized, just look at how determined Black women were. You can see there's a gendered component to this particular movement. Black women are almost outnumbering men, although when you read the history of the Civil Rights Movement, it's almost always told in terms of what Black men did. But as you look on the streets and see who's doing the walking and the talking, one of my favorite political reformers in the Civil Rights era is Fannie Lou Hamer. And she is your everyday person. She talks like an everyday person. We don't have time, I would have played a clip from some of her famous speeches, but she zeroes on that right to vote like very few people before and since her. She attempts to register to vote, and she finds out all the shenanigans that are going on, all the different ways in which Blacks are prevented from exercising their right. And she decides that she's going to tackle it head on. She recruits and trains others to exercise their voting rights. And she not only does that, but she goes right smack in the middle of Democratic politics. She helps to found the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and she shows up in 1964 at the Democratic Convention, and she speaks out for Black people everywhere about some of the challenges of exercising their right to vote. So one of her most famous speeches, by the way. This is a speech in, she says, "Is this the land of the free? Is this America, the land of the free?" And she calls into question all those things wonderful things we're told about the United States. So Fannie Lou Hamer, Google her, YouTube her, if you haven't already done so. And I talked about so many exemplary women, but what I want you to notice is that with the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, Black women not only become a significant voting bloc, they can pick their own candidates and put up their own representatives to influential positions. And that really is what you want to do when you give your voting rights. You want to say, okay, I want this person because this person understands me, this person represents me, this person knows what my concerns are. And those exemplary women take that baton and they walk into the center of the political arena, and they represent Black women, white women, all of us. And they do so in such an impressive fashion that they leave a trail for us to follow. So I wanted to just introduce to some of you I know already know them, some of the African American women giants that we have had so far. A lot of people, when we talk about Black heroes, they can tell you about Martin Luther King, they can tell you about all the civil rights activists, John Lewis, and they can hardly think about anybody beyond Rosa Parks. So I really sort of wanted to end this. We live in the era after the 65 Voting Rights Act was passed, and we saw a lot of gains. We saw a lot of challenges recently to that. And so the fight is not done, but we know that Black women have moved from a marginal to a central position when it comes to exercising their right to vote and selecting their own candidates for the vote. And we see Black women taking those positions and exploiting it to empower their communities. Some of the individuals I find judgeships. A lot of us don't know, there are many different aspects of the political arena that Black women have occupied. So here's a Chief Justice, Constance Baker Motley, and she occupied a position that's usually earmarked for men. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is still influential today, she chaired that Equal Opportunity Commission that was trying to get that Equal Rights Amendment out for women. And she has served as delegate to Congress over and over again. My personal favorite, and that's because of that Caribbean connection, is Shirley Chisholm of New York. She was a feisty little woman, a woman. I never met her, of course, but I looked at videos of her and speeches and all of that, and I'm like, wow. She was the first Black woman elected to the House of Representatives, and 4 years later, she had the audacity to run for president. Wow. So that, she did not make it is beside the point. The fact that she did it meant that she saw herself as center and entitled like anybody else. She spent 14 years in Congress, and even after she retired from that, she continued building the Black coalition through institutions like the National Political Congress for Women. Barbara Jordan, the other day I went to see who are the best, presenters of speeches to the nation, and I usually find Martin Luther King at the top of the list, and then somewhere around 9 or 10, I run into Barbara Jordan. And I found out she was a voice that captivated the nation, especially when she made her 1976 keynote address to the Democratic National Convention. So you might, when you have some spare time, read that and find out why it is such an amazing speech. And by the way, she calls for inclusion. She calls for diversity. She calls for us to tackle our challenges together. And I like that about Barbara Jordan. So she was also elected to Congress, and she served 3 terms. And I can go on and on, but what am I saying? We live in an extraordinary time, and Black women are still crusading for justice, but we've come some ways. And what we're experiencing today are definitely linked to the initiatives of the past. You don't just move from the margins to the center without a crusade. And what I think I've encouraged you to think about today is some of the names of the exemplary individuals and some of the tools and the mechanisms by which they were able to influence the political process in the United States. So I'm going to just remind you, if we're moving upwards. And I'm using the metaphor that Maya Angelou used, still I rise. And instead of saying I say still, we rise. We're leaving behind nights of terror and fear. And I'm being positive here because living in a pandemic situation can, make you wonder. But I still believe that we're bringing the gifts our ancestors gave. And I'm talking about those women pioneers. We rise. We rise. We rise. And if we're determined to do that, we can just be inspired by those who came before us and just make sure that we're part and parcel of the political process. Somebody ought to make that access available to you. And so let's take that baton and continue. So I will leave you with this food for thought. Each and every one of us can strike a blow for freedom. And I don't know that we have any time left, but I want you to know, I want you to think about, reflect about, and share your thoughts on how is it that Black women have influenced the political access that we enjoy today. And this is the thing, a lot of people take the vote for granted. It did not just get placed in your lap. Somebody, a lot of people had to agitate and strategize in order to make that happen. So generally, I just want you to understand, there was a broader crusade that did not include just the rise to the amendment, the 19th Amendment in 1920, that went way beyond it. And as a matter of fact, we are still working on the work that was started by those women.